We talk a lot about 24/7 cities, about nighttime economies, but we know very little about those who work through the night and make this happen. What does it mean to work the night shift? Why are some workers able to move on while others are trapped in exploitative working conditions?
We have two guests to explore the topic of night work and working at unconventional hours. What does it do to your body and to your everyday life?
Welcome to Mobility, Work and Rights, the I Claim podcast, where we challenge common misunderstandings about irregular migration in Europe today. I am Nando Sigona, a sociologist based at the University of Birmingham in UK, specializing in migration and citizenship.
And I'm Ilse van Liempt, a human geographer based at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, and I focus on belonging and citizenship in the spaces of everyday life in Europe. Together, we are your hosts for this series.
We aim to challenge public and political narratives around irregular migration and encourage you to think differently about one of the most pressing issues of our time, charting a new understanding of Europe's migration history in times of rapid political and social change. Our series draws on research from the I Claim project, which aims to improve the living and labor conditions of irregularized migrant families across Europe. The project is funded by the European Commission Horizon Europe programme, a UKRI.
Global cities all over the world increasingly have 24/7 economies. In this podcast, we raise the question what role irregular migrants play in these always active economies. Irregular migrants often work in the informal economy, which includes extended, uncertain, and changing working hours, including the dark hours, the night shift. In this episode, we examine how night work impacts on irregular migrants' bodies and on their social life and their family life, and what can be done to protect the rights of workers. We also look into the housing and working conditions of shift workers in the Netherlands and how workers are sometimes treated as parcels with legs and not as human beings.
Well, to help us answering these questions, we have two great guests today, Ilse. The first one is Julius Cezar MacQuarie, who received a PhD in sociology and social anthropology from the Central European University and currently works at Cork University in Ireland. His research focused on migrant work around the clock. He has conducted fieldwork in Budapest, Istanbul, London, Milano, and Sofia, and has produced short films on the night shift workers. Well, you can check the link to the films in our podcast notes. Last year, he published a book called Invisible Migrant Working, The Night Shift in 24/7 London. Our second guest shares an interest in irregular work and night shift, and in research combined with films. Renzo Sgolacchia is an architect, researcher, and a film producer. His film Living Labor provides a glimpse into the lives of Polish, Spanish, and Roma workers in the Netherlands who live isolated lives, stuck away in container houses at the edges of towns where they work in warehouses and farms.
Let's start with Julius Cezar MacQuarie.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to the interview. My name is Julius Cezar MacQuarie. I'm currently closing a project called Prec Nights, which is a project on precarity among migrant women night workers in Ireland. And from this month onwards, I will be lecturing sociology at University College of Cork. And I'm delighted to be part of your podcast series.
Thank you very much for joining us today. So, Cezar, many cities all over the world want to stimulate their nighttime economy and be 24/7 cities. Could you explain to us what role migrants play in this economy?
Indeed, cities play a major role in developing the nighttime economies, and many cities around the world. Probably at the time of this conversation, there are more or less 60 cities around the world designated with the nighttime economy, or 24/7 cities, and migrants play a huge role in making this happen. So when I say a huge role, I mean that they are the lifeblood of these nighttime economies. And just to say briefly what nighttime economy is, because often in the literature, night studies literature, it's referring to nightlife, which is somewhat inaccurate, Marion Roberts would say, because outside of nightlife, you also have tourism, you have culture nights. So these are other areas that are included in nighttime economy. Migrants' roles are, in a sense, to provide the workforce needed for someone to be up, alert and working. So while we're talking about nighttime economy, we can think of production activities, we're thinking of production lines, we're thinking of the drivers, buses, taxi drivers, you name it, communication, but also within the context of nightlife, we're talking about migrants who provide accommodation services, food delivery, platform workers, food couriers. Most of my work focuses on those night workers who are manual laborers. Often they lack language skills, and therefore nighttime economy or the night work provides an inroad, a pathway for them to access the labor market in host societies. So the role that migrants have is to provide those services which often are refused by highly skilled migrants or the locals.
Yeah. So this extension of work into the night is a very interesting thing. So as you mentioned, migrants play a huge role in making these cities work 24/7. But could you also say a little bit more about how this extension into the night, how that affects working conditions? So what's actually the difference between people who work during the day or people who work at night?
Let's start with time immemorial, when human activity was regulated by seasons and the light. And so it's nothing new to be up and working at night, only that with the advent of capitalism, we are seeing in this phase, in this latter phase, an extension and expansion of the work into the night. And this is done by colonizing the night and the bodies of night workers. And what I mean by that is that in its beginnings, you would have the deadline that was needed in completing, say, a project or the odd night shift. But that has changed, and the intensification of labor, which is basically expansion of the work time, into the lives of workers, into their social lives, into the sectors where night workers are engaging in social family activities, that has become increasingly, shrinked to the extent where capital gains are preferred at the expense of the nighttime workers' colonization of their bodies. And what I mean by colonization of the bodies is that their physiological and circadian rhythm, that 24-hour cycle, is being ignored by this capitalist expansion of work into the night.
Yeah. You have been talking to many people who actually work at night, so as part of your research. Can you maybe give an example of how working at night impacts your body or your life?
Certainly, I've referred to this, most of the workers who are manual workers, so they would include food couriers, taxi drivers, Uber and Bolt, or whichever platform they work for, fruit and vegetable markets, whether indoor or outdoor, on the streets delivering, such as food couriers. One of the ways that they experience this nighttime work is very bodily, physiological experience of exhaustion. And the exhaustion appears when the night shift would go way beyond an 8-hour limit or legal limit in some cases. And so the expansion of the shift to, say, 11, 12, and sometimes 16 hours with get these people dependent, say, on energizing drinks, because that's the only way they could face the night shift. And not only that, but there's also social activity. So you're talking about social isolation. So they feel very isolated from family and friends. So say a Christmas party, or they can never attend because that's the time when they have to work. Depending on the energizing drinks is what keeps them moving through the night. But there's also an element where the problem of going beyond the legal framework of a night shift appears when managers ignore that and push the workers beyond the limits. So in the case, say, someone I call, whom I call Lexa in my book, is a food server in a fruit and vegetable market in London. And she is asking for one night off because she's completely exhausted. Manager ignores it, and she takes the night off. And as a result, he cuts 2 nights off of her wages, which already were below the national minimum wage, considering it's a night work. And it's in London, where we're talking about living wage.
Expensive.
Exactly. So as a result, what she and other people are doing is they take on this sort of rhythm until they can't take on and can't accept the working conditions. And as a result, they quit, they leave, and they find an alternative. And in Lexa's case, I remember after COVID, we met the last time when she told me about the difficulty of not being able to work at the market, pushed her into working for platform work, Uber, Bolt, you name it, she was doing it. COVID came and she became the essential worker where nobody else could deliver such services. So he's an essential worker who is a wonderful example of determination, who succeeded eventually, exited the market, the fruit and veg market, and continued to perform night work, but through a series of long and difficult events while she was doing it. And why I'm giving Lexa as an example is because it's an example of an irregular migrant who worked at the night market, while being some sort of irregular in the sense that she was an EU citizen, but not declaring taxes, not being registered anywhere. So she had no protection whatsoever. And it's important to bring someone like her into the discussion, because then we understand that when these migrants have no protection, then they have no way of defending themselves. And this is what happens in the first stages when a migrant arrives, whether legally or illegally, they end up in this sort of environments where there's no protection whatsoever.
No. And a lot of this is actually invisible to most people. The title of your book is Invisible Migrant Nightworkers. Could you elaborate a bit on this invisibility? Because I think it's a very important topic. You already mentioned that for some people it can actually be very helpful that it's invisible, because they also want or need to be invisible. But then there is different elements as well involved.
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you very much, because it follows on very smoothly from what I said earlier, as you noted. It is important for migrants when they arrive to choose a sector where they're less visible. So to a certain extent, they prefer night work because they're somewhat unseen. And night work provides that corner where they are protected. And what they are protected from is that they arrive in the host countries where the sort of immigration landscape, if you want, take for example the British and the European immigration landscape, which produces to a certain extent a realm of semi-illegality and scaremongering when it comes to migrants. So some of these migrants, and when I say some, I'm talking about the ones whom I worked with, and for my work, being that they were mostly manual laborers, it's almost every worker with lack of English language skills, for example, who ended up doing the night work. And while this happens, let's make it clear, this is not not a choice they made. This is that they forced in the first instance to actually travel abroad and find work, because in their home countries they couldn't. They arrive in the host countries and they're faced with an immigration landscape which basically makes them feel the regrettable necessity, if you want, because they help the capitalist modern societies either to produce daytime or to support the nighttime economy expansion. But at the same time, they're rejected. Yeah. So they're the rejected outsiders.
They're essential workers, but they're not always considered like that.
Exactly. So they're essential workers without essential rights.
Yes.
And this is where invisibility produces this sort of structural, if you want, layer. It's actually a structural nature of invisibility and precarity that brings these workers into a situation where they have no choice but to choose nighttime work.
Yeah. And you have also been actively involved in trying to fight for migrant night workers' rights, so making some of this more visible. Can you tell us a bit about the campaign that you organized?
Thank you. It's very important to me, so I'm really happy that you brought this question on this point, because indeed I have been campaigning for the rights of migrant night workers, because as I explained earlier, many of them lack either the access to the labor market, and there's no one there to fight for them. And mobilizing the workers, after 10 years of working and sort of advocating for them, I realized the mobilization of workers alone is not enough, but unifying the workers from different sectors in night work, it's extremely important.
Yeah.
On top of that, what we need to see is a set of activities. I mean, one of the problems with current labor system is that it's designed for daytime work. Nighttime work, it's some sort of appendix, if you want. It's an adjacent form of work included within the daytime, traditional design daytime labor system. And that's problematic, because if you're talking to, say, a social partner, say, let's think of professional night cleaners. You have huge industry of cleaning industries. These social partners, they come to you and they say, well, why should we think of night workers separate from daytime workers? What is so special about them? And this is where the problem comes into place, because without knowing what the specific needs are, we can't address the issues with night work. So you have social partners. So say the example of unions such as Union Europa. Their work has been very inspiring to me, because they basically bring at the table social partners and European institutions who engage in this sort of activities, such as European Commission, or pledging for European Commission to change the procurement policies. And by changing the procurement policies, we then see a shift from nighttime work to daytime work. So cleaners, this is an example of marginalization and invisibility. So you get professional cleaners who are doing this job mostly at night. So instead of being introduced and included, and perhaps it's okay to see who's cleaning our office, our mess, right? So we need to, instead of having these cleaners around and making excuses that the Hoover makes too much noise in the day and that's why they should be at night, we should perhaps think about the women, people of color, all feeling marginalized because they work at night. So this is one policy barrier. This is an example of why
it's interesting,
this is not working.
Thinking about the fact that people don't want to see the workers. That's also a very important observation. Like, why do we not want to see who is cleaning our office?
Yes.
And you mentioned that there are specific conditions related to night work. Could you give one example of what is specific about night work that the unions maybe should fight for?
The first and the foremost, I would like to say that one of the conditions that affects night workers, it's very physical, it's very biological. And it's something that I mentioned earlier. The current system, labor system, does not acknowledge the fact that while the rest of the society sleeps, some need to be up, alert, and work. And just by the sheer fact that you're up at night when you're supposed to sleep, because remember the physiological rhythm, the circadian rhythm tells us when we should be resting and when we should be active. We should be resting and sleeping at night and be active in the hours of the day. Remember the season and the light, all that's been disrupted. So then one of the key messages here that policymakers should understand, devising or changing, making real changes, have to consider the fact that these humans are not always able to turn up for work at night. And changing policy, meaning allowing, say, an option, a voluntary sort of setting where the worker can have a say in this. So instead of forcing them to come when they're not. This is one of the reasons why accidents happen more at night than in the daytime, because they completely ignore the needs, the physiological needs of the workers. And this is my key message here, because that's what today's capitalist system ignores mostly, is this physiological need of humans to rest and relax, and not to add the fact that night workers, many cleaners are women. So, European, if you were to think of the European scene, when it comes to night work, there's about 40% working at night and 60% are women. Yes. Women who have children, who have difficulties in providing the care, the nursing and the care for children, not to mention the people with who have someone in care. And the reason why they come to do the night shift is because they have to do the care in the day and so on. So
so this has huge implications as well for when they can sleep and rest. So if they also have caring obligations during the day and they need to work at night, it has huge impact on their health, I can imagine.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much, Cezar. Just for those listeners who would like to read your work, could you say something about your book?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. It is a labor of love. The book is called Invisible Migrant Nightworkers in 24/7 London. It comprises of 10 chapters, somewhat closing a long period of 10 years of researching night workers in global cities. And although somewhat, I use the word closure or ending, that it's not per se ending, because I continue studying night workers, but I focus on ordinary cities, smaller cities. I focus on the role of women and contribution of women as migrant night workers. And so this book, I'm very happy to say that it's moving into its second year. I had the pleasure of having a wonderful review made of the book, and it's very encouraging, because now a book is accessible as a soft cover, and as we know,
more affordable.
Exactly, more affordable. And I've noticed that sometimes Springer Nature also gives offers for the electronic version. Soon there will be 2 chapters available at University College Cork. They have this online system. So I'm really pleased that the book is actually becoming more and more accessible, which initially during its first days of publication or first year, it hasn't.
Great. But, thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing your insights on nighttime workers with us. And we are all going to read your book. Thank you very much.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Thank you. Yes.
Julius Cezar gave us interesting insight in how working at night impacts on irregular migrants' physical and mental health. He also gave important pointers to what needs to be done to improve their working conditions. Now let's move to our second guest on the podcast, Renzo Sgolacchia, who produced the film Living Labor.
We I've just listened to Julius Cezar MacQuarie, who shared with us insights from his research on night work in various global cities across the world. Now, you've done research in the Netherlands with precarious workers as input for your film Living Labor. Can you give a bit of context for the listener who has not yet seen your film? Where is your film set? What do we see in your film? How does the landscape look like?
Yes, the background of the film is the typical Dutch productive landscape. So the film set is the Netherlands, and but not the urban environments. Let's say a more suburban or a new urban form. Actually, in the film there is a turning point, kind of shift between an innocent landscape and the productive landscape. So in the film, I try to represent the migrant workers living in this isolated residential landscape, residential sites located in the wood. It's an innocent landscape because it's the place where the Dutch had a long time ago spent the time for their holiday, basically. So it looks always very nice and quiet with the sounds of birds. Then the film somehow shifts and this innocent landscape become a more productive landscape. And we see that the residential sites are next to highways, next to factories, distribution centers, and also greenhouses. So that's the context, that's the film set of Living Labor.
So the context is the Dutch landscape and also a very isolated place. Housing is a very important topic in your film. Can you explain how housing and work exactly is linked in the context that you study? Like why is housing such a crucial element if we want to understand workers' precarity?
Yes, housing has been always linked with labor. Actually, especially if we think about the modern cities during the 30s and 20s, they were conceived. The housing was somehow the fundamental component of the housing for workers was the fundamental component of the modern city, and the kitchen or the housing itself was made for in a very efficient way. And nowadays, the production is completely different. It's not restricted anymore in a factory. The production is in movement, is in circulation. So somehow the housing nowadays is a containerized housing that can move together with the workers. So that's why there was always a link between housing and production. And housing nowadays, it's a mobile housing.
Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on this? So how does mobile housing exactly look like for the people who are living there?
Yes, and the film shows this mobile housing as kind of bungalows, as kind of single boxes that are very small. They are just like 10 meters by 4 by 3. So it's a very small box, similar to a container that is basically located next to other boxes. So we have settlements of 200, 250 boxes. In all of this, basically, in any box, just you can have 3, 4, even 5 people living there. So this kind of this residential site, they look also like a kind of terminal for containers somehow. In this sense, the residential sites, they're very similar to the production that they support. They literally look like a terminal for containers.
And in the Netherlands, there is also quite a lot of discussion on the fact that when employers arrange housing for workers, it makes them very dependent on the employer. So there is this kind of dependency that increases the vulnerability and precarity. Is that something you also came across while making your film?
Yes, of course. The film tries to describe and describes, I think, well, this dependency, the dependency between workers and with the employers. Of course, I wanted to describe this kind of domestic dependency. So we see that these sites are full of rules, some of them really unacceptable rules. While in the factory, rules are fundamental to keep safety in some way. In residential sites, they sound a bit, in some case, even ridiculous, and in some case, the situation are very precarious, let's say. So we see in the film inspections, we see in the film an extraordinary apparatus of security. So in this sense, housing is very similar to a factory, but then there is this kind of this impressive amount of sophisticated system and surveillance that is completely not easy to justify, let's say.
So with the previous speaker, we talked a lot about the night and the evening and night work. So I wanted to ask you if you could think a bit about the role of time in the type of work that you studied and filmed. How does time play a role in this on-demand economy, and how does it shape workers' lives? Can you maybe give an example of one of the workers in your film and how that plays out in everyday life?
Yes, first of all, time is a crucial element, so as the main unit of measurement rather than distances. So it doesn't matter if a residential site is 100 kilometers far from the workplace. Time is the crucial component, and this reflects a lot the life of these people. Time is not just the schedule of the life, is also the component of this kind of logistified life. Their life is driven by the time dictated by the employer. And the employer is often an algorithm that sent to them a message. And through this message, they had to somehow follow the instruction and find the space at the exact time. So there is this clear image in the film. A worker is receiving a message just a few hours before his working shift, and with all the information about the vehicle that will come to take him up and the time that will start to work and so on. And so it's basically everything based on time, regardless of the needs, the distances, and other peculiarity of a common urban life. So these people are rather boxes with legs in this sense. We can see them like in this way.
Wow, boxes with legs. And the algorithm as your employer. It's quite a picture that we get of the current economy and how workers are exploited in this economy. As a final question, I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a bit on how you, as a filmmaker and an architect, how do you foresee the future of this economy?
It's very, it's not so easy to understand, of course. This kind of architecture in this economy is always described without humans. Automation is always automation of the delivery through drones, always present in the description of the future scenarios. Rather, I think that if we keep with our feet down on the earth, we still see these distribution parks, greenhouses, production full of workers. Because incrementing the speed of delivery, we need to increment the facilities, and then we need more workers. The food delivery, Amazon, Bolt.com, whatever, all these activities needs an enormous amount of workers. So it's It's just an utopia to see these activities without humans.
So we need to keep seeing the humans within this economy.
Yes, we cannot really have the so-called homo ludens that can live without any productive activity. Just a kind of utopia, actually.
So thank you very much for sharing your insights and your amazing work. I would recommend everybody to go and see your documentary, Living Labor. We will post a link in the episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
The conversation we had made me realize how we often just take it for granted that our offices are clean when we arrive in the morning. The food that we buy at the market is just there at any time of the day. I think the interviews with our guests reveal all the invisible labor behind these everyday situations. Night work is often considered work that resets spaces in the service of daytime employment, but we actually know very little about this resetting. Who are the workers involved in it? This episode has really shown how night work is disproportionately performed by marginalized, often racialized workers whose labor rights are under serious threat and not often campaigned for. It's, for example, often argued that traveling at night is dangerous for women and that they better stay in. But when you look at who is in the night bus, there's quite a large number of female workers who need to travel to work at night. Their safety in that situation is not considered in the context of their working conditions. Nando, do you have any thoughts on how we could develop more awareness in our research on irregular migration to this time dimension, to make sure we don't overlook invisible work at unconventional hours, and that we move beyond looking at the more taken for granted places and times in research?
I think, Ilse, this is a very important question, both methodologically and empirically. It also highlights some interesting gap or blind spot in research. We know very little about the night workers. We know very little about what does it mean, to implement this idea of the nighttime economies. I think Julius Cezar gives amazing examples, and also methodologically he provides a lot of interesting insights for us. It also reminds us how important is ethnography, how important is ethnographic work. How is it not enough sometimes to think about qualitative research only as a one-off interview? Obviously, a one-off interview enables you to gather data, gather a sort of hints into the experience of people, but being able to observe, to share that experience, to work the hours, to feel on your body the meaning of doing the night shift, as in the case of Julius Cezar, it's something else. It adds a new dimension. It really helps you and give more power to what you find. So I found the work extremely inspiring, and in a way, I think what we try to do in our research, and as we have discussed at the times, we focus on domestic work, but also on delivery work and logistics and on agriculture work. So we have different kind of work relations and also timings in the work. Like, for example, one of the elements which came out at the beginning of our project, I don't know if you remember, was this issue that, well, we cannot really do work with the migrant work in agriculture in the winter because they are not working in the winter. So the idea is that you need to have a flexibility in research, in your fieldwork, to adapt. However, it's interesting as well, another point. Obviously, in the summer, people are working in agriculture. This we discussed with our colleagues where in countries where we do the agriculture work. And yeah, people are working in the summer, but they are very busy. They are exhausted. And later on, we're going to talk about exhaustion. So they may not have time to talk to you. And in the winter, they may reflect better on their experience from what they did in the summer. So the capacity to listen is always, I think, a fundamental thing that we need to stick to. Just I would like to think with you about this idea of the exhaustion. And in migration studies, the term politics of exhaustion is sometimes used referring to the way exhaustion is employed as a tool of border regimes, but also how the system is experienced by migrants who are constantly faced with uncertainty. Do you see any connection, Ilse, with this idea of politics of exhaustion when discussing irregular migration and night work?
Yes, for sure. In this 24 hours economy and flexible capitalist economy, we see that all the pores of the working day are considered to be needed to filled up. And I think in Renzo's work, you also see this really coming to life when people are constantly waiting for a call or needing to be ready to be called to go to work. And I think, this neoliberalism has really resulted in round-the-clock work for all of us. I think it puts people's work-life balance under a lot of pressure. But for irregular migrant workers, this pressure is even higher because they're most of the time working in this informal economy. They also have less power over the working hours, so they are in a way more controlled, have less agency. But there's also the other side, obviously, that working in the informal economy, working in more invisible places and at times where there is maybe less police control or less control by the labor inspection, also gives the opportunity to earn money. So I think the exhaustion is there for sure, but there is also the other side that the informal economy is offering opportunities to work and to survive.
You're right. I mean, I think one of the questions that you asked to Julius Cezar is about, what can be done. And I think he's a very good example of a researcher who also has thought through, the impact side. How do you bring change? The fact that it makes us realize is this idea that, yes, the people that work the night shift are exhausted. Some people are able to move on to different jobs. Often are people with more secure legal status or people who can afford to do it. And some people instead are trapped. They're stuck there. And all the time in the day is eaten out by the work. They sleep during the morning when the offices are open, even the trade unions are open, and they work at night, and they have no time in between. And this is also, as you mentioned earlier, affect their life, their friendship, their relationships, their capacity to look after their children, etc., etc. But I think there is also, in Renzo film, there is a powerful connection that is made between what we call the politics of time, the way that migration regimes and the capitalist system control the time of the workers, but also the role of space, because he talks about housing and how the house become part of the system, isn't it? These containers he talks about, and he talks about the Netherlands. Do you want to tell us something about, this place where these container camps are located?
Yeah, he talks about the containers where migrant workers are housed, and the fact that these locations are often really at the edges of cities, like in between highways and industrial zones, far away from cities, from amenities, from shops, so in that sense also the accessibility to social life is not only restricted by the working hours, but also by the space, because there are very often, it's impossible to go to somewhere, or there is no bus, or there is very difficult connections.
And also, I think that one thing which was striking is the amount of rules that are imposed on the people that lives in these containers. It's not Airbnb. It's not like renting a house. I mean, this is much more like a hostel for homeless people, where you have a time in which you can have your shower, you cannot have gas, you have to have special permission for occupy, put a chair outside your door. So it's very much a very regimented form of housing, which really exercise huge form of control on also the capacity of people to think outside the box in which they are closed, literally.
In that sense, they're also really treated as workers only who need to be efficient for the economy. Boxes with legs. I also thought it was quite shocking to hear about the implications of working at night. You mentioned this embodied experience, how being sleep deprived impacts your whole physical health, but also your mental health, and how difficult it is for people to have a social life. I thought it was really revealing. And again, I think this is only something that you can really understand when you have this more ethnographic experience, when you also yourself experience the physical implications. I wanted to also share a reading with the listeners, because I recently came across another quite interesting article. It's called Cleaning Up Westminster, and it's based on an ethnography with racialized night cleaners at Westminster, so at the Parliament. And I think it's really an interesting read for those of you who want to read more on this topic. It's so paradoxical to read how the cleaners feel exploited, unheard, undervalued inside this particular building that is designed to protect representative democracy. So we will put the link in our socials, and then people can read more, because I think this is really an understudied topic, and we need to keep the conversation going.
I also have a shout out, and it's an article, a working paper written by Pia Vogler, who carried out research in a refugee camp in north of Thailand about 20 years ago. And what she worked on was the nightlife of refugee camp, exploring what happened in a refugee camp when the humanitarian workers are no longer there because they go back to their home, their nice home in the neighborhood around the camp. And this is again interesting because, as you point out, it's also not just about the exploitative employer here. In this case, it's the humanitarian worker that basically exercise the forms of control on the space and on the agency of the refugees. And the night become an opportunity somehow for informal economy, for exchanges, for breaking somehow, in inverted commas, the rules. So it's interesting work because also take us outside the West, at South UK and Europe, bringing alternative perspective. Okay, so we are done for this episode. Thank you so much for joining us today for Mobility, Work and Right, the iClaim podcast. To make sure you don't miss any episode on our series, please subscribe on your favorite podcast provider or join the iClaim mailing list on our website, www.iclaim.eu. We would love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. Share your comments and questions with us via our website or social media. From me, Nando Sigona.
Me, Ilse van Liempt. See you next time.